Honestly, maybe you should just marry me. She didn't laugh. She never laughed at that one again. For 9 years, I told myself the most important person in my life was just a friend. It took a $12 shelf, an April afternoon, and one moment of silence to unravel everything I'd been too afraid to admit. My name is Ethan Cole, and I almost let the love of my life hide inside a joke forever. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, have you ever said something as a joke and meant every word of it? Drop where you're watching from too. Don't forget to subscribe for more real emotional stories. Now let's begin. My name is Ethan Cole, and I'm going to tell you something I've never said out loud in quite this way before. Not because it's shameful, but because the truth, when you finally hold it in the light and look at it straight on, has a way of making you feel a little foolish. And I was raised by a man who treated foolishness like a second mortgage. You don't carry it if you can help it. I'm 31 years old. I live in the Midwest, work in structural engineering, and I'm genuinely good at calculating how much weight something can hold before it gives. Everything else in my life has been considerably harder to measure. I have a brother named Derek, 2 close friends, Caleb, who communicates almost entirely in sarcastic 2-word texts, and Marcus, who has the emotional range of a golden retriever. I have an apartment on the 4th floor of a building with a broken elevator I pretend not to mind. And I have Maya Reyes, 29, curly dark hair she always said she'd cut shorter, but never did, and the kind of laugh that doesn't wait for permission. She does freelance graphic design, reads 3 books at once, and will explain her opinions about fonts to you whether you asked or not. We met 9 years ago at a housewarming party. She was arguing that arrival was both romantic and devastating at the same time, and that was exactly the point. I thought, that's someone who thinks about things properly. 3 hours later, I had her number and a feeling I'd know her for a long time. I was right. I just didn't understand yet what that would mean. We were the people each other called first. When she went through a bad breakup, I drove 40 minutes in a Thursday thunderstorm and sat on her couch for 4 hours without saying anything useful, because sometimes that's the only thing that is useful. When my dad got sick 3 years ago, not terminal, but frightening in that hollow way, she showed up with food I hadn't asked for and stayed until I stopped pretending I was fine. She always knew when I was doing that. She had a specific look for it, a small tightening around the eyes, like she was quietly making a note. We knew each other the way you know a city you've lived in for years. Not every street, but well enough that the map of the other person had become part of how you move through the world. And somehow, despite all of it, I had convinced myself it was simply friendship. A category, a box that explained the shape of the thing. I was very good at fitting things into boxes. Occupational habit, probably. This is the story of the day that box finally broke open. It was the 2nd Saturday of April. Maya had texted me at 9:15. I ordered a shelf. It's a tragedy waiting to happen. Bring tools and patience. I only have one of those. When I got there at 12:04, she opened the door in gray sweatpants, mismatched socks, and a navy hoodie I recognized as mine, stolen sometime in February and never returned. "You're 4 minutes late," she said. "Good morning to you too." The shelf box was on the kitchen floor, half opened, its hardware scattered in a pattern that made clear the 12 minutes of self-belief had not gone well. She handed me a coffee, exactly how I take it, made before I arrived, and we fell into it the way we always did. Easy, immediate, no warm-up required. She sat on the counter reading the instructions aloud in the most insulting voice possible. We argued about shelf placement, about her succulents, about her candle collection. "This one," I said, picking one up, "smells like every other candle in here." "That's cedar vanilla." "This one," I said, picking up a second, "also smells like every other candle in here." "Smoked vanilla. Completely different." "They're the same candle with a different story attached." She shoved my arm and laughed. That laugh, the one that showed up and took over whatever room it was in, and I had the thought I'd had 100 times before. That ordinary things, tedious things, felt genuinely better when she was in them with me. I had always accepted this without examining it. I was about to stop. When the shelf was finally up, she stepped back, hands on her hips, evaluating it like a completed construction project. I looked at it, looked at her, and said the line I'd recycled a dozen times over the years. Easy, light, the kind of thing that was technically true and could be deployed without cost. Honestly, Maya, maybe you should just marry me and save us both the trouble. It was a joke. It was always a joke. But Maya didn't laugh. She went still, not dramatically, just a small specific stillness, like a radio cutting out between frequencies. I smiled for a half second, waiting for the punchline. She looked at the shelf, then at the floor, then at me. And very quietly, she said, "I thought you were never going to ask for real." The kitchen was silent. Outside, the April afternoon continued without us. The open window, the street noise, the light coming through at its late Saturday angle. Everything ordinary. Everything unchanged. Except that something, somewhere in my chest, had just moved. "What?" I said. Maya swallowed. And the look on her face, the one I knew how to read in every other context, was telling me something I had never, until this exact moment, known how to read at all. Maya didn't look away. That was the thing I noticed first. Any other time she'd said something vulnerable, and there had been moments, over the years, small cracks in the surface, she'd soften it immediately. A joke, a subject change, a quick retreat behind that easy confidence she wore like a second skin. But not this time. This time she held my gaze, and I could see the effort it was costing her. "I'm serious," she said. "I can't do this joke with you anymore." I opened my mouth, closed it. The drill was still in my hand. I set it down on the counter slowly, the way you move when you're not sure the ground is stable. "Lena," I started, and then caught myself. Maya, old habit. I'd called her Lena once, years ago, a nickname that had lasted exactly 1 week before she'd told me it made her sound like a Victorian housekeeper, and I dropped it. The fact that it surfaced now, in this moment, told me something about how thoroughly my brain had short-circuited. "You keep saying things like that," she continued, her voice steady but careful, like someone carrying something across a room they're afraid to drop. "And you laugh, and I act like it doesn't get to me. But it does. It always has." She crossed her arms, then dropped them again, like even that felt too guarded for what she was trying to say. "I've been in love with you for years, Ethan." For about 2 full seconds, I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. Not because it made no sense. That was the strangest part. It made too much sense, too fast, arriving fully formed like something that had been waiting just off stage for a very long time. My brain rejected it on impact the way it rejects things that rewrite too much at once. "What do you mean, years?" I said. She let out a small, quiet laugh. Nothing happy in it. More like relief that we were finally standing in the actual conversation instead of dancing around the edge of it. Exactly what it sounds like. She looked away briefly, then back at me. "Remember that night your car broke down outside the city? It was February, raining. You called me at 11:30, and I drove out without thinking twice about it. Just got my keys and went." I remembered. Of course I remembered. "We sat in your car for an hour waiting for the tow truck," she continued. "And you fell asleep against the window halfway through. And I sat there watching the rain and thinking I would do this every time. Any hour, any weather, without hesitation. And that's when I knew. That's when I stopped being able to pretend otherwise." The February night came back to me in full. The dark highway, the rain on the windshield, the way she'd arrived without complaint or question, like it had never occurred to her that showing up was optional. I had thanked her and thought, that's just Maya. I had filed it under the enormous category of things she did that I'd stopped examining. "The barbecues," she said. "Every time you'd show up and find me before you found anyone else in the room. The Sunday I got food poisoning, and you stayed the entire day even though I told you to leave at least 4 times. A small pause. "The way you always know. You just always know when something's wrong, and you show up like there's nowhere else you're supposed to be." Each thing she named landed like a stone dropping into still water, and the ripples moved outward through 9 years of shared history, rearranging everything they touched. Not changing the facts. The facts were all still true, but the light falling on them had shifted, and everything looked different in this light. I sat down. Not gracefully. I found one of her dining chairs behind me, and sat down in it like my legs had made the decision without consulting the rest of me. I stared at the kitchen floor, the small hexagonal tile she'd been meaning to replace since she moved in, the grout line near the stove that had never quite been right, and I let the rearranging happen. I thought about the dates. All of them. The women who had been smart and kind and genuinely good, and who had somehow never managed to feel like enough. I had blamed myself for that. Told myself I was too guarded, too unavailable, too accustomed to solitude. I had carried that explanation for years like it was a diagnosis. But sitting in that chair, staring at those tiles, a different and considerably simpler explanation presented itself. They weren't her. That was all. That was the whole answer. Not a flaw in me. Not a pattern to decode. Just a fact so obvious it had hidden behind its own plainness for nearly a decade. I stood back up. Maya was watching me, very still, waiting. I could see in her face that she'd prepared herself for more than one outcome. She had been brave enough to say the true thing out loud, and now she was ready to absorb whatever came back. I looked at her. Really looked, the way you look at something when you finally stop pretending you don't see it. And I said, I love you. No smile to soften it. No laugh to give us both an exit. Just the words, flat and honest and long overdue. She stared at me. I love you, I said again, quieter this time, like the first time had been for both of us and the second time was just for her. And I'm sorry it took me this long to stop hiding that behind a joke. A stunned pause stretched between us, long enough that I felt the first edge of doubt, and then something in her face changed. The held-breath quality of it released, slowly, like a knot finally letting go. She believed me. Our first kiss felt nothing like the movies. No dramatic score, no sudden certainty arriving from outside. It felt like recognition, like two people arriving at a place they'd both been circling for years, finally stopping and saying, here, this is the place. Like something both of us had already known. The rest of that Saturday disappeared quietly. We didn't make any grand declarations after the kiss. We didn't sit down and formally discuss what had just happened, assign it a label, map out the implications. We just stood in her kitchen for a moment, close enough that I could feel her exhale, and then she said, very softly, with the beginning of a smile, I can't believe it took a $12 shelf. I laughed. She laughed. And just like that, the unbearable tension of 9 years dissolved into something that felt, remarkably, like relief. We ordered food that evening. Sat on her couch the way we always sat on her couch, her feet tucked under her, me with my arm along the back, except that now my hand was in her hair and neither of us was pretending that was a neutral thing. We talked for hours. Not about the future, not about logistics or timelines or what this meant for every mutual friend who was about to feel extremely smug about it. We talked about the past. We filled in the gaps. She told me about the moments she'd almost said something and hadn't. I told her about the dates. All those fine, perfectly adequate evenings, and the specific hollow feeling of driving home afterward, which I now understood with embarrassing clarity. You knew, I said at one point. You knew about the dates. I had a theory, she said carefully. You had a theory. I didn't want to be arrogant about it. Maya, I thought maybe I was projecting. You were not projecting. She smiled into her coffee cup, and I made a mental note to be mildly annoyed about that later, when the warm glow of revelation had settled into something more manageable. The days that followed were strange in the best possible way. Strange because almost nothing changed, and that was the part one hadn't expected. I had assumed, somewhere in the back of my mind, that crossing this particular line would feel like entering foreign territory. New rules, new rhythms, a whole unfamiliar landscape to navigate. But it didn't feel like that at all. It felt like the same landscape with the fog finally lifted. She still texted me first thing in the morning about whatever odd thought had surfaced before coffee. I still called her on my drive home from work without deciding to. We still argued about the same inconsequential things. The candles, her pasta sauce deliberations at the grocery store, whether the parking spot near her building was technically legal or merely tolerated by an indifferent universe. All of it intact. All of it exactly as it had been. Except now I didn't have to pretend the small things meant nothing. 3 days after the shelf, she came over to my apartment and spent 2 hours making fun of my fridge while eating the last of my leftover rice. She was wearing one of my t-shirts, a different one this time, one she'd apparently located in my closet and claimed without discussion, and she looked completely at ease in my space in a way she always had, except that I was no longer filing it under she's comfortable here and moving on. I was just watching her and feeling something I didn't have a precise word for. Not happiness exactly. More like correctness. Like a measurement that had finally come out clean. She caught me staring. Why are you looking at me like that? She asked. I'm realizing, I said, that this is the first time in my life something this important has felt easy. She set down the fork and came over and put her arms around my neck and said, quietly, into the side of my face. That's because it was never the wrong thing. It was just late. I held on to that sentence for a long time afterward. We told people gradually, which turned out to be unnecessary because apparently everyone already knew. Caleb's response, delivered via text at 11:15 on a Tuesday night, was, "Took you long enough." 4 words. No punctuation. I sent back a single thumbs up, and he replied with a gif of someone shrugging that I chose to interpret as congratulatory. Marcus called. Actual phone call, which for Marcus was the equivalent of a formal ceremony. He said he was happy for us. Then he said, "I told you 3 years ago, man." I told him I didn't remember that. He told me he absolutely had said it, at a barbecue, standing by the cooler, and that I had changed the subject immediately. I told him that sounded like me. He said, "Yeah, it did." Derek, my brother, texted, "You look less annoying now that you've admitted the obvious." Classic Derek. Efficient, affectionate in a way that required decoding. His wife sent a separate message that was just a string of heart emojis, which I appreciated for its clarity. Maya's sister Simone called her. I was there when it happened, and I could hear her through the phone from across the room. Not the words, just the tone, which was somewhere between relief and vindication. Maya rolled her eyes and smiled the whole time. When she hung up, she said, "Simone says," and I quote, "Good. Now he can stop pretending he invented emotional confusion." I considered this assessment. "That's fair," I said. "I thought you'd say that." What struck me most, across all of it, was the absence of surprise. Nobody reacted like this was a twist. Nobody needed it explained. There was no "really?" Or "when did that happen?" Just a collective, quiet, slightly exasperated finally. The sound of people who had been watching something obvious for years and had simply been waiting for the last 2 people involved to catch up. Which, I supposed, was exactly what had happened. A few weeks in, on a quiet Sunday morning, I sat at my kitchen table with coffee going cold beside me and tried to locate the precise moment it had started. Not for any particular reason. Just the way you sometimes retrace a route after you've arrived, noting the turns. I couldn't find it. There was no clean origin point, no single moment I could point to and say, "There, that's where it began." It had grown the way most important things grow, gradually, below the surface, without announcing itself, until one day the evidence was everywhere and had been for longer than you realized. What I found instead, tracing back through the years, was not a beginning. Just an unbroken line of showing up. Both of us, for each other, without hesitation, without keeping score. The love had been in that all along. We had been building it without knowing what we were building, the way you sometimes construct something load-bearing before you understand what it's going to have to hold. I finished the cold coffee and looked out the window at the spring morning. And I thought, I need to do this properly. I bought the ring on a Wednesday. Not impulsively, or at least, not in the way impulsive usually looks. I hadn't walked past a jewelry store and been struck by sudden inspiration. I had thought about it for 2 weeks with the same methodical quiet I brought to load calculations at work, turning it over, checking it from different angles, making sure the structure was sound before committing to it. By the time I walked into the store, I already knew what I was looking for. Simple, honest, nothing that was trying too hard to announce itself. Something that looked like it had always belonged somewhere specific and had simply been waiting to get there. The woman at the counter asked me what my partner liked. I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "She has strong opinions about design," I said. "She'd notice if something was trying to be more than it was." The woman smiled like she'd heard 1,000 versions of this and handed me something understated and clean, a thin gold band, a single stone, no excess. I looked at it under the store light and thought, yes, that's the one. Not because it was the most impressive thing in the case. Because it was the most honest. I paid for it, put the box in my jacket pocket, and drove home feeling simultaneously calm and like my heart was conducting some kind of internal stress test. The harder question wasn't whether to ask. That had been settled the moment I sat down in her kitchen chair and the obvious thing finally became obvious. The harder question was how. Maya was not a person who responded well to performance. Grand gestures made her suspicious, not because she was cynical about sentiment, but because she had excellent instincts for the difference between something genuine and something constructed to look genuine. She would see through choreography immediately. She would appreciate the effort and then gently dismantle the artifice with one perfectly aimed sentence, and I would deserve it. It had to be real. It had to be ours. I thought about the park. There was a small neighborhood park about 2 miles from where we'd both grown up. Nothing remarkable about it. No particular reason it should matter to anyone who hadn't spent formative hours sitting on its benches drinking bad coffee from a gas station cup and talking about the future with the total confidence of people who had absolutely no idea what the future actually held. We'd gone there constantly as teenagers, less as adults, but it never stopped being the kind of place that sat quietly in the background of our shared history. One of those landmarks that gets stitched into the story before you realize it's significant. That was the place. I didn't tell anyone the plan except Caleb, who I needed for logistical backup, and who responded with the single word finally, and then nothing else for 6 hours, which I took as enthusiastic support. I told Maya I wanted to take a walk on Saturday afternoon. No further context. She gave me a look, the evaluating one, the one she used when she was trying to determine whether I was being straightforward or whether there was something underneath, and I held the look steadily and gave her nothing. A walk, she repeated. Fresh air. Exercise. Very normal human activity. You're being weird. I'm being healthy. She studied me for another 2 seconds, then apparently decided I wasn't worth the full interrogation. Fine, she said. But I'm not going anywhere that requires real shoes before noon. It was 1:30 when I picked her up. She was wearing a light jacket over a yellow shirt, her hair down, and she looked like spring had been specifically designed around her, which was the kind of thought I now allowed myself to have without immediately filing it under irrelevant. She didn't recognize where we were going at first. Then, as I pulled onto the familiar street, I saw it register on her face, the small shift, the softening. The park, she said. The park. She looked out the window as we drove past the old corner store, the elementary school with the fence that had never quite been repaired, the intersection where we'd once stood in the rain for 20 minutes because neither of us wanted to end the conversation. Her expression was quiet and fond in the way that only specific places can make a person look. I haven't been here in years, she said. I know. We parked and walked in from the east entrance, the way we always used to. The path was the same. The trees were further along than I remembered, taller, fuller, their new April leaves catching the afternoon light. The bench we'd claimed as teenagers had been replaced at some point. New wood, same green paint, but the spot was identical. Same view of the small hill. Same angle of light in the late afternoon. Maya walked beside me with her hands in her jacket pockets, looking around at all of it with the unhurried attention she gave to things she was genuinely glad to see again. She wasn't suspicious yet. She thought this was nostalgia. A nice afternoon, a meaningful location, a gesture of tenderness from a man she now knew was considerably more sentimental than he'd spent years pretending to be. She was not wrong about any of that. She was just missing one detail. We stopped near the bench. She turned to me, smiling. Okay, I'll admit it. This was a good idea. I have those occasionally. Don't push it. I looked at her standing there. Jacket, yellow shirt, April light, that smile, and every rehearsed version of this moment I'd run through over the past 2 weeks dissolved completely. What was left was just the true thing, plain and unadorned. I spent years making that joke, I said, because I was too scared to say it like I meant it. And then you forced me to stop hiding behind it. I reached into my jacket pocket. Her eyes went wide immediately. And every version of my life that makes any sense has you in it. Not in some vague, general way. In the real way. The whole thing. She put a hand over her mouth. I got down on one knee, looked up at her, at the tears already forming, at the laugh she was fighting to contain, at the face I'd been looking at for 9 years without fully understanding what I was seeing, and I said, Maya, maybe you should just marry me and save us both the trouble. She laughed so hard she had to look away. Then she looked back, tears running, and said, You are so lucky I love you. A breath. Yes. Obviously yes. I had the ring on her finger before either of us fully registered it had happened. She pulled me up and kissed me, and somewhere nearby a couple walking past smiled without slowing down, like they'd already known the answer before the question was asked. Which, honestly, was about right. The drive home from the park was quiet in the best way. Maya had her left hand resting on the center console, fingers spread slightly, glancing at the ring the way people glance at something they're still convincing themselves is real. Not obsessively, just occasionally. The way you check a door you're almost certain you locked. I kept my eyes on the road and said nothing, because some moments don't need commentary. They just need to be allowed to exist at their full size. Halfway home, she reached over and put her hand on mine. That was all. No words. Just that. I think that was the moment it became completely, permanently real to me. Not the kiss in the kitchen, not the ring in the jewelry case, not even the proposal itself. Just her hand on mine on an ordinary drive home. The city going about its business outside the windows, the late April light doing its slow fade. Something so small it almost wasn't anything. Something so familiar it had happened 100 times before, except that now neither of us was pretending it was nothing. We called our families that evening from my apartment, sitting side by side on the couch with the phone between us. Her mother cried before Maya finished the sentence. I could hear it through the speaker. Not sad crying. The other kind. The kind that sounds like relief releasing pressure it's been holding for longer than anyone admitted. Her mother had always been kind to me, warm in the specific way of someone who had made a private decision about you years ago and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Maya's sister Simone picked up on the second ring. There was a pause after Maya told her, and then Simone said, very evenly, I have been waiting for this phone call for 4 years. I need a minute. And then she laughed, and Maya laughed, and I sat there feeling simultaneously grateful and mildly convicted. My brother Derek answered with, what's up, in the tone he uses when he's pretending he wasn't already looking at his phone. I told him. There was a pause, and then he said, yeah, that tracks. Followed immediately, and I believe sincerely, by, I'm really happy for you, man. Derek's version of emotional expression has always required translation, but I've had 31 years of practice. That one landed exactly as intended. Caleb, who already knew, sent a message at some point during the evening that said simply, took you long enough. I had expected nothing less. Marcus called the next morning. Actual phone call, which meant he had feelings he needed to transmit in real time. He told me he was happy for us. Then he said, I told you, man. 3 years ago at that barbecue. I told him I vaguely remembered. He said, vaguely, was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I told him he was right and thanked him, which seemed to satisfy him completely. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. And that was the thing I want to be honest about, because I think it matters. Love stories, the way they get told, tend to locate all the meaning in the revelation, the moment of confession, the first kiss, the proposal in the park. As if those moments are the destination and everything after is just credits rolling. But the weeks after were where I actually understood what I had. Tuesday evenings when she came over and we cooked dinner badly and argued about whether what we'd made counted as a recipe or an incident. Saturday mornings with coffee going cold on the table because the conversation kept interrupting it. Her sending me 3 photos from the grocery store because she genuinely could not choose between 2 pasta sauces without a second opinion, which had been happening for years, but now came with a small heart at the end of the message that made me smile every time like I hadn't seen it before. Her bad days. The ones where she was quiet in that particular way, where the cleaning happened aggressively and the answers came in single syllables. I knew that version of her as well as I knew any other. Now I could just sit with it directly, without the distance of pretending I wasn't paying attention. I could say I know something's wrong out loud, and she could say yeah out loud, and we could just be in it together without the performance. My bad days too. The ones that arrived without warning and made everything feel heavier than it was. She had always known about those. Now she could acknowledge them without waiting for me to give her permission first. That was what changed, really. Not the love itself. The love had been there, doing its quiet structural work, long before either of us named it. What changed was the permission to be direct about it. To stop translating everything into the language of friendship and just say the actual thing. I used to think the great love of my life would announce itself unmistakably, that it would arrive with the force of something impossible to overlook, some dramatic convergence of circumstance and feeling that would make the decision obvious and the path forward clear. It didn't look like that. It looked like a text about a shelf on a Saturday morning. It looked like mismatched socks and a stolen hoodie and an argument about candles that all smelled the same. It looked like 9 years of showing up and a joke that finally stopped being a joke, and a woman who was brave enough to say the true thing out loud when I was still hiding behind the punchline. It looked like April light through a kitchen window. It looked like years of reaching for the same person first and pretending that meant less than it did, and then one ordinary afternoon, finally, mercifully, stopping. I'm not the most naturally expressive person. Derek would confirm this. Caleb would confirm it with a gif. My mother would confirm it with a story from 1997 that I've asked her not to tell anymore. But I know what I have. I know what it took to get here, and I know the exact cost of almost missing it entirely. If there's anything I'd tell someone else, anyone standing where I was standing, convinced they've correctly categorized something that's been quietly outgrowing its box for years, it's just this. The most important thing in my life arrived looking exactly like an ordinary day. Pay attention to your ordinary days. That's where everything real is hiding. Thanks for watching. If this story meant something to you, please like and subscribe for more unforgettable stories about love, resilience, and second chances.